Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to use a South African expression which I think covers us all, which is all protocols observed. And you're most welcome to this Humanitarian Diplomacy Dialogue. I think the important aspect of this dialogue is that we would like to make this as interactive as an engagement as possible. And to do that, we would allow our panelists to briefly, in 10 minutes, give us a snapshot of what their views are on the Millennium Development Goals, and then open up for a discussion which we hope will allow you to also share your views and ideas on what the progress has been in terms of achieving these goals, but more importantly, what the future is, considering the fact that we are fast approaching the deadline, which is 2015, for their delivery. I think the important thing for me also in this debate is that we should focus our conversation around specifically looking at how Africa itself has performed, not just in its delivery of these goals, but what the challenges have been. And I think we'll look to our panelists in particular to lead this discussion. So without further ado, I'd first of all like to thank the International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Society for organizing this debate. And we really look forward to having more such engaging conversations where we can really engage in a rigorous debate on these important issues. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Austin Chulu, who is MGD Policy Advisor at the United Nations Development Program. I won't read through your extensive CV, which is present in your packs that are on your chairs, to really give us a sense of what the view is from the United Nations perspective. It's particularly important, I think, Austin, for us to engage on this issue from a UN perspective, because 192 members of the United Nations signed up to deliver on the objectives of the MGDs. Can you give us a sense of what these 8 goals are, how we have progressed in delivering on them, and finally, if you think Africa is doing enough?
I'll try to squeeze 65 years of development in the human development area in 10 minutes. As you well know, the United Nations was formed in 1945 in October on the 24th. And its mandate was specifically to keep world peace and ensure that we do not regress back to a situation of a global conflict. Now, this mandate has grown over the years, over the past 65 years, to include areas or issues of human development, issues of space exploration, and so on and so forth. So many things have happened in the last 65 years. Now, the MDGs were a synthesis of just one branch of the mandates of the United Nations, and that was to deal with human development. There had been, over the years, a number of international conventions, agreements, commitments, and so on and so forth, some relating to the welfare of children, others relating to the welfare of women or equality in the sexes, some referring to environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth. And we came up with a multitude of international agreements, which in some way all pointed towards the fulfillment of human development, that is, ensuring that a human being who is on this planet has a decent standard of living. Now, in the year 2000, that was 55 years after the formation of the United Nations, world leaders came together in the General Assembly and agreed to this synthesis of all the various agreements, and they culminated into the development of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. Actually, in 2000, what came out of the General Assembly Summit was the Millennium Declaration, which reaffirmed the rights of the individual to lead a decent life. The following year, in 2001, that's when the Millennium Development Goals were actually agreed upon and signed off. There's 8 of them that basically gives a snapshot of areas that the world leaders considered essential for a decent standard of living for every human being. The first one was poverty. You had to look at reducing the proportion of the population of the world living below $1 a day. Now we've revised it to $1.25 a day. Looking at education attainment for all children. We were looking at the issue of gender equality and empowerment of women. Looking at the issue of child mortality, reduction in the number of children that die before the age of 5. Looking at the number of children that, reducing the number of children dying before the age of 1 in infant mortality. There was another goal which looked at issues of maternal mortality. As you know, the developing world is plagued with a lot of mothers, a disproportionate number of mothers dying before or during childbirth. There was also the goal on reducing HIV and other preventable diseases in Africa especially, and globally, considering Latin America and Asia. The issues of sustainable environmental management, looking at provision of sanitation, clean water, and finally there was the MDG for a global partnership, which basically looks at creating a level playing field in the global trade and global development arena. Now, having said that, at a global level, we've been doing quite well, I must say. That's at the global level. Latin America has moved out of a lot of the issues that we were talking about earlier. Southeast Asia and China, India, etc. They've also moved quite significantly out of that. But progress in Africa has been lacking. Lacking progress in the sense that in some countries we've moved people out of poverty from, say, 99 cents to 102 cents. So we've increased, we've reduced poverty by a huge proportion just by increasing levels of poverty through some government transfers. But the question is sustainability. Africa is really, really struggling to sustain development efforts. And I think maybe the debate should be focusing on how we can sustain the development efforts in Africa, looking inwards rather than looking outwards. I'll mention just a few of the challenges that we are facing. One, in terms of MDGs, that is, poverty is not going to be met. Maternal mortality is really backward. Infant mortality and child mortality are still a problem to face. But HIV, which is a big, big problem in Africa, has not been addressed at all. We have still touched the very surface of the problem. And I'm also going to talk about, as we go on in the debate, talk about the issues of private sector involvement in the achievement of the MDGs. As you know, traditionally we've kind of ignored the role that private sector takes in achieving the goals. Mm-hmm. And we've concentrated all our efforts on advising governments to strategize on how to approach the problems of MDG.
So, Dr. Chulu, you've indicated to us that it's a question of creating a sustainable manner of implementing these goals. Can you give us, from the UNDP perspective, one such initiative that has proved to be sustainable in trying to achieve MGDs?
I think the problem with the achievement of the goals is both human resource related as well as financial resource related. Now, in terms of sustainability, one would want to look at ways of raising resources within a particular economy through capacity development initiatives that we've actually assisted, say for instance in public sector management, in private sector inclusion into the economic arena, also looking at how governments can better be able to channel their existing resources towards MDG-related expenditures.
Now, given the fact that we're fast approaching the deadline for the MGDs 2015, and as you indicate to us, the majority of these deadlines, or rather objectives, goals, have not been met, what's the UNDP going to do about this? Is there anything they can do?
Yes, we've been working on what we call an acceleration strategy, a scale-up acceleration strategy. Scaling up efforts to mitigate especially those MDGs that are lagging behind in the various countries. And you know, progress has been different in different countries. South
And
Africa,
what's the response been, specifically, not just from the UN perspective, but from member states of the United Nations? Is there buy-in for the scaling up?
there is a lot of buy-in. In fact, this year, as we speak, during the last summit that was concluded in September this year, the world recommitted themselves to scaling up efforts to achieve MDGs. Now, the nature of that scale-up is what we should be talking about. Some quarters believe increased resource flows from the developing countries from the developed countries to developing countries is part of the solution. But I think the solution is much more within the various countries themselves. Once they get out the resource mobilization at the domestic level, look at resource allocation at the domestic level, and look at inclusive participation of all in the economic endeavor, I think progress can happen. It's been proven to work. Look at countries such as South Korea, Laos, Vietnam, etc. They've come out of similar situations as we're facing today in Africa, but they've managed to actually move on with focused policy interventions and the inclusion of public sector.
Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Dr. Chule, and I think it's a great point for us to bring into the conversation, Professor Ogude, because one of the things that Dr. Chulu mentioned was that, is this supposed to be premised on increased flows of development assistance from the developed north to the south, particularly when you look at the African context? What is Africa doing in terms of implementing these Millennium Development Goals? But more importantly, is this yet another case of ideas and initiatives being imposed on Africa?
Thank you, Chris. I want to start by saying that I'm a literary and a cultural practitioner. So I'm very interested in issues of human subjectivities and the politics of representation, and ultimately, the human face in all these debates. But my comments will be premised on three legs. The first leg of my comments will focus on what I think is the significance of the declaration of these Millennium Development Goals. That's the first leg that I want to start by affirming it, as my colleague here has done. The second aspect and the second leg of my comment relates to what I think is a lurking danger. A lurking danger in the way that the Millennium Development Goals have been conceived, and the danger of it turning yet again to reinforce certain stereotypes about Africa, especially by focusing on the failure of the Millennium Development Goals, when indeed I think a great deal of advances have been made. And the final leg of my comment relates to what I think the future possibilities that this continent could explore in order to realize the Millennium Development Goals. Not necessarily within the 2015 target, Because as I will argue, and forgive me, I'm an academic, I think it was excessively ambitious, especially for a country, a continent like Africa. Now, first, let me go back to, the initial leg that I talked about. I think what for me has been very important is that the MDGs have been so critical in galvanizing, and drawing, the support for Africa, but also drawing attention to the continent. For a long time, Africa was only important or only gained attention during moments of crisis, and we know it. That the only time the world community turned to Africa was when there was a major crisis, whether you are thinking of famine in Somalia, whether you are thinking of, Darfur crisis, whether you're thinking of the Rwanda genocide, which the world community actually accepted that they intervened very late in the day. It is only during those moments that Africa received any attention at all. And I think that, for me, what the Millennium Development Goals have done is to help to galvanize, external support for fighting, poverty, and refocusing attention on issues that for some time had been forgotten. Those of you who lived in the 70s know that one of the rallying cries during the immediate post-colonial period of independence, all our politicians talked about eradication of poverty, disease, and ignorance. And the huge mileage was covered during that period, the period after the 60s and the 70s. And then, of course, came the emergence of austerity measures that marked the 80s. And a number of these issues were totally neglected. And so the beginning of neglect of a range of social issues started very much in the 80s. And I'm trying to argue that, in a sense, it seems to me that the emergence of Millennium Development Goals helped to refocus the attention of the world. I also want to suggest that I think, in spite of the constant refrain, I think there is uneven, but nevertheless, political commitment on the part of a range of players, including state actors, to the achievement of Millennium Development Goals. And we see it in spite of the recent financial crisis, the financial meltdown. We still get some form of commitment from the political players. Now, I want to move on to the second point, and that is, I want to make the point that although the MDGs continue to place Africa's challenges at the center of the world stage, there's a sense in which the manner in which these goals were formulated, the manner in which these issues were articulated at their inception, and indeed the way in which the instruments of measuring success were coded, tends to reinforce certain stereotypes about Africa, that Africa is failing. I don't want to contradict my colleague here, but every forum after forum that you go to, what you hear about is African failure, not the successes. And I'm worried about that. I'm worried about that problem because in the process, they detract from real achievements. And sometimes they make it impossible for us to draw attention to the real problems that are plaguing, this continent. Virtually everybody seems to be unanimous that sub-Saharan Africa stand out in that it will not meet any of the goals. I want to give you a couple of examples to concretize what I'm talking about. The UN World Summit declaration stated in part, Africa is the only continent not on track to meet any of the goals of the Millennium Declaration by 2015. The Blair Commission, in Africa, the world is farthest behind in progress to fulfill the MDGs. Africa is well behind target on reaching all the goals. The main report emanating from the 19 UN project relating to investment development also says sub-Saharan Africa most dramatically, watch those words, the choice of words, has been in downward spiral of AIDS, resurgent malaria, falling food output per person, deteriorating shelter conditions, and environmental degradation. So that most countries in the region are on a trajectory to miss almost all the goals. As late as 2007, a follow-up to the Blair Commission says, however, at the midpoint of the MDGs, Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region which at current rates will meet none of the MDG targets by 2015. Now, my argument is not that Africa's performance is good in all areas, but its relative performance looks worse because of the particular way in which the MD targets are set. They are excessively ambitious, as I put, and there's nothing wrong with ambition, but I've taught for many years. I've realized that when you set goals even for your students and they are unrealistic, it can lead to a paralysis and demoralization when those goals are not realized. Take, for example, the goal of a proportional reduction in poverty. That is cutting poverty rates in half. It does not recognize the fact that the percentage reduction in poverty is a highly non-linear function of per capita income. If, for example, one starts with a low initial per capita income, then the elasticity will be low. This means that it will take more growth of mean income to achieve the same percentage reduction in poverty than it would in a country with a high per capita income. Africa is thus disadvantaged in this goal of poverty in half, in this goal of cutting poverty in half by having the lowest per capita income in any region. I think, I believe that all is not lost in the continent, that there is need for us to do a number of things. One of the things that we need to do is to focus on good information systems, because it's very important. You cannot solve problems if you don't have proper data about population, health, mortality rates. A number of the figures that are often quoted are either very old data or totally, fairly generalized, gleaned from very poor, data quality. And I think we need to focus on that we need to build an information system that will help us to identify the problems in very concrete statistical terms. Then the final thing that I want to make is that we need, and I want to agree with him, that the only way we are going to solve problems in Africa is to mobilize Africans from below, African communities, by going back to investing in local resources, but also reigniting local agency amongst people. The top-down approach cannot help in solving problems in Africa. And ultimately, I want to argue that the problem should not just be left to state actors alone. It needs all of us, whether it's the civil society, the academics, the media. I think it's very critical in drawing attention to problem areas in the continent, but more importantly, exposing problems in areas of governance. Those are very critical for me in achieving some of these goals.
There's this tension between the state and civil society around who delivers on human security for the people. the MGDs speak specifically to human security and the need to deliver on these objectives. The state, in many ways, as we've heard, has failed. Has civil society succeeded?
Okay, so I think the first thing I would say is that, if the MDGs fail, all of us fail, including civil society in terms of really getting to where we want to be. But also for me, we talk a lot about the measurements, the targets, and so on. And beyond all of those numbers are people. And really it's a question of, at the high-level summits and so on, with the technical language and all of that, it's important to have that framework. But I think often, we go too far away from the people and what the real issues are. And I want to agree that part of the solution is, if nobody on this continent, in terms of ordinary citizens, understand what the MDGs are, or what their rights are, or what governments have committed, I think it's going to take us a really long time to try and get to some of these things. But also in terms of, beyond the dependency issues, beyond the issues of economic growth and so on, I think it's important to go kind of behind the scenes, because again, at the high-level events, a certain position is presented. But let's just go back before the summit and look at what were some of the discussions and debates amongst African leaders. The first, in terms of the MDGs, was there was a position being pushed that African governments should only focus in on 2 MDGs to meet by 2015. And there was quite a big and a lot of discussion about whether this position should be presented in New York. And only after a very strong lobby to push back on leaders to say, actually, all of these MDGs are important, they're all interconnected, and if we're going to focus in on 2, beyond 2015, it's too late to then start focusing on some of the other ones. So that was one of the kind of pushbacks that needed to happen just before the MDG summit. The other was that African Union finance ministers, when they were meeting, a lot of them were arguing that all the commitments that heads of states made are not realistic. They shouldn't be going around making these commitments. So commitments on financing in terms of health, agriculture, education, and so on. And they were really arguing that those things should be deleted from Africa's position that will be presented at the MDG summit. And again, just on the one clause, it took us about 3 hours to try and really push back, and ultimately the AU then endorsed the position and recommitted, heads of states recommitted to those commitments, because one of the things we were arguing as well is, if African leaders go back on their commitments, how do we then expect to put pressure on G8 countries, for example, in terms of some of their commitments? In some senses, it kind of felt like a victory. But if you really look at it, the Abuja Declaration kind of end date was 2010, and only 6 countries reached their financing targets. So now the deadline has been extended, which on the one hand seems good, but on the other hand, it's just pushing the date again. But one of the good things that had come out was this issue of monitoring where African governments are, and African governments presenting to the African Union their progress that they're making in terms of the MDGs, which I think it's an important step forward. But also with a lot of lobby work and campaigning, some of the issues like maternal and child health, where Africa is doing really badly, there were some really good resolutions coming out of the AU summit. But again, resolutions are one thing. How those get implemented back at home within different countries is something else. After the MDG summit, I'll just quote a few views from civil society organizations. Many organizations came into this week's summit with high hope for new financing, but will walk away feeling disillusioned. Somebody said you can't eat an aspiration. At the end of the day, nearly 1 billion people are still going to go hungry. And somebody else said the summit has been a mirage. The promises look good from a distance, but the details are hard to see. That's just some kind of perspectives. One of the issues has been kind of blaming the global financial crisis for why we kind of way off some of the targets. But even if you look at before the crisis happened, countries were still kind of well away from those targets. It was also interesting during the crisis that a lot of money was found to bail out, the big banks and big companies. Yet at the same time, over the years, trying to find financing for the poor has been such a difficult aspect. But kind of moving forward, I think there are some positives. If you look at the G20, one of the things that the French are kind of leading and starting to push is the issue of the financial transaction taxes, for example, which is really looking at an innovative way of bringing in more resources that's going to help achieve some of these goals. But also, the issue of domestic resources as well, because for me, as long as we're dependent, I think we're only going to go so far as Africa to meet some of these goals. So, in a lot of countries, a lot of money has come in, there's a lot of money in the coffers, but that money gets diverted elsewhere to pockets or somewhere else. And that obviously has a big, impact in terms of whether we are going to achieve, some of these goals. So for me, the failure to meet deadlines, budget targets, and then taking decisive action as leaders is what's causing this huge gap between aspirations and people's lives. Another important thing is the issue of growth. We've seen in an example of South Korea was given, where as you have growth happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to feed into your development agenda. And I think that's another thing that countries like South Africa, France, and South Korea are kind of really pushing within the development committee of the G20 in terms of ensuring that whatever growth happens, there's a direct link to development. And that's the only way, you're going to ensure that a lot of these initiatives are financed. But also, one also has to look at the issues of inequality. And, countries like South Africa, where, inequality is growing rather than the gap becoming shorter. So, that has to factor in within the kind of MDG framework, but also in terms of other human rights kind of aspects as well. I think it's clear in terms of moving forward, things that need to be done. The MDG committee at the AU level has a clear plan in terms of up to 2015 and beyond 2015, what needs to happen there, in terms of financing, in terms of targets, and all of that. Largely, it's kind of really the collective effort and the will that is needed to drive this effort. And I think one thing the MDG has done, the framework, has really kind of pulled people together. And I think greater mobilization across government, civil society, and private sector and others, really needs to happen. And I'll end off with Martin Luther King's words, because, a lot of this we see within a world of crisis. And he says the ultimate measure of leadership is not how it acts in times of certainty and comfort, but rather how it acts in terms of uncertainty and crisis.
Interesting perspectives. Thank you, Puvin. You speak of times of uncertainty and crisis, and Martin Luther's motivational words, but you also indicate that there's a sense of disillusionment on the part of civil society, that they talk of mirages when they see the Millennium Development Goals. What then is it? Is civil society seeing disillusionment, or do they see themselves as active partners?
Yeah, definitely there's disillusionment in the sense of, empty promises that have been made over the years, that haven't been met. But I think based on some of the real progresses that has happened, and we have seen progress, and some of the other speakers were talking about progress on this continent as well. I think that progress gives hope and kind of inspiration in terms of moving forward, because we know these things can be done. We know what to do, to make it happen. If you take any issue like maternal health, for example, it's really clear how you can prevent a mother from dying while giving birth. All it takes now is kind of really the will and ensuring the resources and proper planning to kind of make some of these things happen.
What will the basis of this implementation be? The coordinated approach between governments and civil society? Have you seen a locus of planning and engagement?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that, some of the planning has not been inclusive. So, it's, I mean, I think over the last 5 years or so, I mean, MDGs are largely driven by government. Civil society engages in some of the dialogues, but kind of plays more, like a watchdog role almost, in terms of monitoring the implementation. I think it's really important that pressure stays on, but much more active engagement in terms of planning, because ultimately it takes all these different partners to make it happen. And I think inviting more participation across the board is really critical.
Mamsadi Luka, it's been said, and Puven has said it, governments shouldn't make such commitments. Do governments have the right to make such commitments? But more importantly, when you make such commitments, and we're now faced with the situation that we've heard earlier, where we may not deliver on these targets, aren't we creating these mirages that Puven has spoken about?
Well, thanks. That's a billion-dollar question. I think I will start my comments by just briefly focusing on the South African development context, and then that will be followed by the efforts towards domestication of the MDGs, because the MDGs have been created by the UN, and for us to be able to ensure that they are properly implemented, they have to be domesticated so that they can fit within the local context. And then briefly touch on South Africa's achievements and areas of less success. But then focus again on the key success factors, the challenges, and proposed corrective actions. Because I think that's where we've got to end to say, so what? And in terms of the context, I think we all are aware that South Africa is doing well in terms of economic growth, but when it comes to human development, the Human Development Index, we are really doing very, very bad. And if you take a step back and ask yourself a question in terms of what has been happening to poverty, what has been happening to unemployment, what has been happening to inequalities, much as we have indicated even in our report of this year's report that there are some achievements, but we still see glaring poverty, we still see unemployment, we still see inequality, which is mainly now not just interracial but also intra-racial. And the impact of poverty and HIV and AIDS, which is felt mainly by women and children. We've got good policies which are in place, but why are we seeing a rise instead of a decline in these issues? And South Africa, like all the other developing countries, is a signatory of the Millennium Development Goals. And South Africa, I think, is also blessed that it does not wholly rely on aid for the implementation of the MDGs. And the MDGs in South Africa, the conception of the MDGs have dovetailed very well with the development approach that has been adopted by the new democratic government post-apartheid. And as they are, they do have some challenges and limitations, but they provide legitimacy to the government's development agenda, which since 1994 has focused on improving the living conditions of the poor and vulnerable in South Africa. And the MDGs also provide a framework for measurement of the country's performance using the clear indicators that we've got. And to date, as South Africa, we've submitted 3 reports, one in 2005, 2007, 2008, and 2010. But the attempt to domesticate the MDGs within our own local context is seen in terms of the government, the medium-term strategic framework. Or maybe one should start by indicating that we've got a constitution in which human rights are enshrined, and we also have the legislative framework that is also pro-MDGs. And for this term, we have developed the medium-term strategic framework, which is a statement of intent and which has 5 strategic objectives that are also aligned to the MDGs. And there are a certain number of indicators, I think about 95 indicators that South Africa has crafted in an effort of domesticating the MDGs to the local context. But also, there are also outcomes, because the government has now taken a step in terms of ensuring that whatever that is done is outcome-oriented and no longer focusing on outputs. Because I think the challenge in terms of outputs was that the issue of quality was compromised. And now the focus being on outcomes, it will assist in terms of also balancing quality as well as quantity. And there's also political commitment to the MDGs, and that has also been reflected by the launch of the One Goal Education campaign that was launched by President Zuma in support of the UN MDG advocacy campaign. But when we come to in terms of performance, we have achieved in terms of a few goals, that is Goal 1, Goal 2, Goal 3, and Goal 8. But much as there is achievement, for example, in terms of Goal 1, one would begin to see that Goal 1, the indicators are more economically based and very, very narrow in terms of the social dimensions of poverty, and it is actually more about income and consumption rather than building the capacity of people, to self-help and etc. And then goal number 2, which is about education. Yes, we have made lots of achievements in that area, but the question is about the quality of education, which is still an issue. In terms of promoting gender equality, a lot has been done in that area, but there are still challenges in terms of mainstreaming gender in development planning. And we know that women are actually central in terms of achievement of certain goals, Goal 1, Goal 2, 3, and those women are very central in that. But when it comes to, for example, Goal 4, those that are health-related, we see that South Africa is not really doing very well. And we can link that with the Human Development Index, that we are not really doing very well in that area. Infant and child mortality rates are very high, maternal mortality rates are very high, much as there is a little bit of a decline in terms of the new infections of HIV and AIDS, but it's still alarmingly high. What are the challenges? Because what we are saying is that despite the achievements made in terms of poverty, hunger, and unemployment and inequality, these issues still remain serious challenges for South Africa. That is poverty, hunger, unemployment, and inequality. The MDGs, therefore, did not really make significant inroads in addressing South Africa, these challenges that we are facing as a country, which find their roots in colonization and the erosion of indigenous and or traditional social and economic systems. And when you look at how poverty is defined in terms of the MDGs, it is defined in terms of income and consumption, and these parameters cannot adequately capture or reflect the realities of the poor in South Africa. And hence, it is important that a bottom-up approach is adopted, because the realities of the poor are understood better by the poor. And if you use those realities, you'll be able to develop appropriate indicators. There's very little recognition given to qualitative, non-tangible, and non-income indicators, which are mainly on the social dimension. People cannot participate meaningfully if they don't have a voice. The power relations in communities, the power relations in politics, people cannot really begin to participate well and make meaningful contribution to influence social change. Empowerment of the poor and the vulnerable and will not really be achieved if those power relations are not sorted out. The MDGs also are not adequately localized, and most communities are not aware of their existence, and they are not even fully empowered to fulfill their roles, because development is not just about feeding or giving. It's about people also seeing themselves as active partners in development rather than simply passive beneficiaries of development. But there's a need that there is that empowerment of people. The role of African indigenous knowledge systems towards achievement of MDGs is really not acknowledged. And I think in Africa, we've got a lot of innovation that can be linked to our own indigenous knowledge and technologies that could actually be an answer to our problems, and especially the poor and the vulnerable, instead of always importing programs from the West. And when are we as Africa going to share our best practices with the West? Are we supposed to be always going to the West to go and find best practices when we really do have our own best practices, but we have been socialized to undermine what is our own, as if whatever that is black, it's demonic, or whatever that is black is inferior. Women empowerment is also crucial for achievement of MDGs 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and yet, as I indicated earlier on, gender in development plans is not effectively mainstreamed, and also gender-sensitive budgeting is also still a challenge. And there's a growing perception, especially in South Africa, I'm not quite sure in other African countries, that government is a wholesale provider of goods and services. And I think it is because of the unintended consequences of the development approaches that we adopted that simply has resulted in a paralysis in communities, where communities are just sitting in waiting for government to deliver, instead of seeing themselves as solutions and part and parcel of the solution to the problems. The working in silos, not only within government, but also government, the private sector, and civil society. We all want to achieve one goal, but we are moving in different directions, and there's a need for that. Now, coming to the proposed corrective interventions quickly, it's that I think we all acknowledge that women are crucial in the achievement of MDGs, and it is crucial to promote their empowerment, their rights, their development and well-being. Building the capacity of African countries is important to harvest their IKS, or indigenous knowledge systems, which remains an untapped resource, and harness them to improve agricultural production, food and nutrition security, and health outcomes. For example, if you look at household food production, why should we use treated, genetically modified seeds? Because if you use it today, you can't use it tomorrow. But if we've got a bank of our own traditional seeds, you can use it today, tomorrow, and it is a hardy seed that can actually withstand the climate change that we are facing today. A community advocacy and mobilization strategy on MDGs must be developed and implemented for effective engagement on localization of the indicators. And dialogues with communities, in particular civil society organizations, on the social determinants of poverty and hunger in order to develop appropriate and relevant development interventions in line with the MDGs. And we also have to advocate for the recognition of the less tangible and qualitative indicators that promote self-help, ownership, self-esteem, voice, commitment, as well as accountability. We must also advocate for the use of participatory learning and action approaches to ensure that a people-centered development agenda is developed. And also using various and relevant media and public platforms to support and empower local communities to become active participants in working towards achievements of the MDGs. And lastly, I think what we have also to do, and I'm saying this not in the context of South Africa, but in the context of Africa, that we need to develop adequately consulted guidelines for localization of MDGs in Africa, and make sure that we actually do partner smartly, the private sector, higher education institutions, and all the civil society organizations, in order to be able to make it. And I would like to say that yes, we can, if we have to do it. And perhaps also ending with a quote from William Ward that says, "Blessed are those who see the need, realize that their responsibility, and act to be the answer. And I think we are here. We have realized and we have seen the need. We have realized that we've got a responsibility and we have to act because we are the answer. And thank you.
Indeed we are. Thank you for that intervention. One of the things that fascinated me about your presentation was the fact that poverty is defined as income and consumption as a measurement. How do you believe then poverty should be measured?
Poverty, yes, should be. We can use income and consumption, but that should not be the only method or approach of measuring poverty. I think it's also very important that we have to engage our own communities so that we can also have a shared understanding of how they perceive poverty, how they define poverty, because sometimes we come up with our own standards, and actually mostly we come up with our own definitions, our own standards, and we want to impose those to communities. So we need also to look at other qualitative measurements of poverty.
For example?
For example, you may be, for example, spiritually poor, and if you are spiritually poor, you don't see the world. You just see doom. You've got the money, you've got everything, but because you are spiritually poor, you end up abusing drugs. You end up committing suicide. So it's not just about money. It's not just about having to eat. It's also about ensuring that you are a balanced person. So poverty should be defined in terms of ensuring that it provides answers towards building a fully, a whole person and not just, one limited area.
All right. So what I'd like our panelists to do is of course, try and answer the myriad of questions that have been posed to you, but also when you arrive at the end, would appreciate it if you could just provide us with a nice summation of how you viewed this conversation on MGDs.
Africa actually is the Eden of the world. Africa is resource rich, but Africa is economically poor. I think what's important is decolonization of the mind, people first and greed last, build capacity, transfer appropriate technologies. And one thing that we've got as Africa to acknowledge is that there is wealth at the bottom of the pyramid. We might be at the pyramid as Africa, but we are in very big numbers. Why can't we rely on our own market? Because the same applies to the poor. If you look at South Africa, for example, billions of monies goes into grants, but the grant beneficiaries are not even aware that they are rich. Because if they can organize themselves, imagine, just putting a rand together, how much they would have. So there's wealth at the bottom of the pyramid. And then just to sum up, I would like to say that this conversation for me is very, very important, and I think we are going somewhere. But I would like to say that it's important that we've got to draw from the lessons learned, because we have implemented, there are very important lessons. And let us not be ashamed of our failures, because we can learn from our failures. And I think it's also important that we can set up an Africa best practice bank that we can all tap into and share information, because each country has its own best practices, but how do we share those best practices? And then the UN should also provide technical support for monitoring and evaluation impact assessment. Let us not just report, but once those reports have been, they've been, now my pen is running away from me. But once those reports have been adopted, let's look at where countries are failing and succeeding, and let's go to those countries and begin to assist. And then the very last one is that I would like to see, an Africa summit on MDGs Beyond 2015, so that as Africa, we can then craft our position in terms of how we would like to see these goals and these targets being reviewed, so that they can also take into consideration the issue of limited resources, and how we can actually utilize our own resources to begin to make a difference in our own countries. Thanks.
I mean, I think one of the fundamental issues is around resources. And if you look at all the kind of larger problems emanating, whether it's a mass rape, mobile populations, etc., a lot of what's driving that is the mineral wealth, which is kind of ironic in many senses, the so-called resource curse. But also a lot of countries, I mean, Uganda is a big exporter of minerals, but where are those minerals coming from if Uganda doesn't have that many mineral wealth, itself? So for me, a lot of it is really getting to the bottom of what's actually causing some of these problems and not just, addressing kind of some of the symptomatic things. I think the issue of accountability that somebody raised, I mean, for me, accountability at all levels and all institutions is really important, including civil society organizations. I think it's important to be kind of self-critical, reflect within, but also hold each other accountable. But at the same time, for me, ultimately, it's going to be the citizens that hold everybody accountable, whether it's government, whether it's civil society, private sector, or any of the other players. And I think until we get to the point where citizens are fully engaged and understand what these commitments are, the MDGs and so on, I mean, we need to get there. And I think ultimately that's where accountability would come from. The last one is around the issue of the role of civil society. I mean, civil society plays quite a big role in terms of the advocacy work, in putting pressure and so on. But it goes much broader than that. There's a range of things where civil society works very closely with government around research. If you look at the issue of HIV and AIDS, care work that happens within communities, in some instances working side by side, implementing in terms of water and sanitation, for example. So I think the dimensions and the relationship with government varies, and sometimes is schizophrenic, holding them to account, but at the same time also working very closely with governments. And I think ultimately it's kind of the partnership that's going to make this work. But also if you look at MDG 8, in terms of the global partnership, it's really important that we really push for some of the critical reforms that need to happen to ensure kind of proper partnership.
I want to start by saying that I think Africa does not just need strong leadership. Africa also needs visionary leadership, but also an understanding and a caring leadership, because that is what this continent has been lacking over the years, a caring, sensitive, and visionary leadership. And I think that is, for me, first and foremost. That is one thing, to push people around like a herd of sheep and tell them that, you're getting development, keep quiet. At the end of the day, when you close those democratic spaces, I can assure you, within a decade or so, there will be no will for development. So I think, for me, that is very critical, a visionary leadership and a caring leadership. The second thing that I want to touch on relates to, and we keep going back to government. I think government is important, but I'm wary of thinking that the solutions to this continent lies squarely on the shoulder of the government. Governments all over the world create important frameworks, and we need to push them to do that. But I think I do agree with that lady from, is it the Swedish embassy?
New Zealand.
New Zealand embassy. But I think the private sector has to play its role. It does everywhere. It's only in Africa where, with a few exceptions in South Africa, where the corporate world plays an important role in the lives of many people. But it also takes me back to the issue of perception and attitude towards the continent, that we need investment. It's not for the governments. If we're all rushing, a few years ago when I was growing up, you were assured of getting a job if you were a graduate. But the public service could only take so many. So you need a thriving private sector that can employ people gainfully and at the same time intervene in the lives of people. So I think capital investment and attracting it is critical. And the final thing that I want to make is structural imbalances, especially global structural imbalances. These, for me, are things that we cannot run away from. If there is trade imbalance between North and South, for God's sake, don't require the South, we don't blame the South if they don't develop. And the G20 has been G8, has been confronted by some of these issues over and over again. And I want to argue that we need to push for these changes. The civil society, academics, all these organizations need to push for fairness in world trade. It is critical because I'm told capital outflow from Africa is actually more than the capital gain that comes back to Africa, and it relates to the issue that the gentleman over there was talking about. Why are people quick to push Africans to buy military hardware, and not invest in other things? It's self-interest. For that, I think Africans have to fight and get their priorities right.
There is really a very thin line between dependency on external resources and the issue of development using resources from outside. There are countries that do not have the wherewithal to actually raise their own resources and need a push from the outside. I think the question is more, what do we use the resources that are coming from outside for? And this brings in the issue of governance. It brings in the issue of accountability. I'll tell you a country where a good chunk of development assistance went to buying Mercedes-Benz Maybach for the president and the wife and stuff like that, instead of going towards development. But these are issues that relate and point to one other thing: the role of the people themselves. What are the citizens of each of the countries doing to ensure that leadership is accountable to them on what they do? In many cases, you find that rather than the leaders being accountable to the people, it's the people who feel they are accountable to their leaders. And there's this one-way process of fear that the leadership is going to punish me if I maybe don't turn a blind eye or something like that. But this has to change. And it changes with information. If the populace is not informed, one, about their rights to an education, about their rights to a good health, about their rights to a proper standard of living, in whatever definition that country defines that standard of living, then you will not have this two-way process of leaders being accountable to their people, and their people making sure that they put in place leaders who are going to deliver on their behalf. So there's a process of informing the public on what their rights are, and also empowering the public to take their leaders to task when things don't work out and services are not delivered. The last thing is the importance of information and data. I think that was alluded to so many times, but I think this is critical. If you don't know where you are right now, you won't know where you are going. In many countries in Africa, we've worked in quite a number of African countries, the bureaus of statistics are relegated to backwater buildings in the middle of nowhere to provide quality statistics to governments to make decisions upon. But you find, and it has been raised before, that the quality of information that goes to leaders to make the proper decisions is lacking. And therefore, we find this lack of focus in decision making that relates directly to the relegation of statistics as a second-class activity within government circles. I think it should be up on top. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think what is left to be said is really to thank our panelists today for your interventions, which I found to be both incisive and very insightful. I think what we have learned from our discussion on MGDs is that we have more to be positive on than to be negative on. Yes, there certainly is a lot to be done in terms of ultimately reaching these objectives, but certainly 2015 should not be the benchmark which we should judge ourselves on the African continent.